This story is for educational purposes, and I mean no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this case. My intention is to present the information objectively and respectfully, aiming to foster understanding and knowledge. Graham Young was born on Sunday, the 7th of September 1947 to Frederick and Bessie Young in Neasden, Middlesex. He had an older sister, Winifred. After his mother died of tuberculosis, when he was 14 weeks old, Young was sent to live with an uncle and aunt while his sister went to live with their grandparents. Several years later, Young's father remarried and the family were reunited. Young was fascinated from an early age by poisons and their effects, and considered Victorian poisoner William Palmer to be a personal hero. He also read extensively about black magic, Adolf Hitler, and Nazi Germany. In 1959, as he passed his 11+ and went to grammar school, Young started to read books on advanced toxicology. In early 1961, Young acquired antimony from a local chemist, signing the poisons register in the name M.E. Evans. His knowledge of poisons and chemistry convinced the chemist that he was older than he appeared. Beginning in February, he began poisoning members of his family. First, his stepmother Molly suffered vomiting, diarrhea and excruciating stomach pain, which she initially dismissed as bilious attacks. Before long, his father suffered similar stomach cramps, debilitating him for days at a time. Soon after, his sister became sick on a couple of occasions over the summer. Shortly afterwards, Young himself fell violently ill. It even seemed as if the mystery bug had spread beyond their household. A couple of Young's school friends had similarly been repeatedly absent from school, both suffering from similar symptoms. In November 1961, Winifred was served a cup of tea by her brother one morning, but found its taste so sour she took only one mouthful before she threw it away. While on the train to work an hour later, she began to hallucinate, had to be helped out of the station, and was eventually taken to hospital, where doctors came to the conclusion that she had somehow been exposed to the poison Asatropa belladonna. Young was confronted by his father, but he claimed that Winifred had been using the family's teacups to mix shampoo. Unconvinced, Young's father searched his room, but found nothing incriminating. Nevertheless, he warned his son to be more careful in future when messing about with those bloody chemicals. On Easter Saturday, the 21st of April 1962, Young's stepmother died. Her death was attributed to a prolapsed cervical disc, which was believed to have resulted from a road accident. Much later, Young told police that he poisoned her with a lethal dose of thallium. At her wake, Young poisoned a male relative after lacing a jar of mustard pickle with antimony. Shortly afterwards, his father became seriously ill and was taken to hospital, where he was told that he was suffering from antimony poisoning and one more dose would have killed him. Young's aunt, who knew of his fascination with poisons, became suspicious, as did a science teacher, who discovered several bottles of poison in his school desk. The teacher and the headmaster arranged for Young to be interviewed by a psychiatrist posing as a careers advisor, who contacted police after Young revealed his extensive knowledge of poisons and toxicology. Young was arrested on the 23rd of May 1962, after returning home from school. Vials of thallium and antimony were found in his possession. When questioned by police, he confessed to poisoning his father, stepmother, sister and a school friend. Psychiatrist Dr. Christopher testified that Young had a psychopathic disorder rather than a mental illness, and had failed to develop a normal moral sense. He felt it was extremely likely that Young would reoffend and recounted a conversation in which Young said, "I am missing my antimony. I miss the power it gives me." Dr. Christopher recommended that Young be detained at Broadmoor Hospital in Berkshire, an institution for patients with mental disorders who have committed criminal offenses. Dr. Donald Blair, another psychiatrist, concurred with Dr. Christopher's viewpoint. Young pleaded guilty to 3 charges of poisoning his father, sister and school friend, and was convicted of malicious administration of a noxious thing to inflict grievous bodily harm. He was not charged for murdering his stepmother, as her autopsy report did not list poison as the cause of death. The judge, Justice Melford Stevenson, ruled that Young was to be detained under Section 60 of the Mental Health Act at Broadmoor. Furthermore, he was not to be released for 15 years without the approval of the Home Secretary. Despite the fact that there was insufficient evidence to try the 14-year-old Young for the murder of his stepmother, he was convicted of poisoning his father, sister and friend Chris Williams, and the verdict found there was a lack of moral sense at the heart of his personality. These days we might be tempted to label such character traits as psychopathic. He was sent to Broadmoor Maximum Security Hospital with an order that he was not to be released without the permission of the Home Secretary for 15 years. He would be Broadmoor's youngest inmate since 1885. While on remand awaiting trial, he was already telling psychiatrists, "I miss my antimony. I miss the power it gives me. Where there's a will, though, there's a way," and within a few weeks of his arrival at Broadmoor, a fellow prisoner named John Berridge had died of cyanide poisoning. This was the same Berridge that Winifred Young says Graham complained about in letters, expressing irritation at his loud snoring in the communal dorms. Nevertheless, the authorities were baffled, as there was no cyanide to be found anywhere in the prison. Young then corrected them, patiently explaining how cyanide could be extracted from laurel bush leaves, of which there were copious amounts in adjoining fields. But his confession was only one of many, as tends to be the case whenever someone dies in a mental institution, so the official verdict was suicide. On another occasion the staff's coffee was found to contain Harpic bleach from the toilets. From then on, staff would joke to inmates, "Unless you behave, I'll let Graham make your coffee." Meanwhile, Young was still pursuing familiar interests. According to the British Crime Monthly murder casebook, he grew a Hitler moustache, and making hundreds of wooden swastikas to wear round his neck. These hardly appear to be the actions of a man anywhere near being cured of whatever mental illness had afflicted his young mind. But Graham Young's doctors were confident that in time he would grow out of these adolescent obsessions. Their hopes appeared to have been fulfilled by the end of his 5th year inside, as he had become a model prisoner, and was moved into a less strict block with more freedoms. It was suggested to Young that he might one day be able to pursue a university degree if he got better, which appeared to convince him to go cold turkey on his toxicology addiction. Despite this, it was later revealed by Broadmoor contemporaries of Young that as late as 1968, nearly 6 years into his sentence, 2 whole packets of sugar soap, a cleanser used to wash down the walls before painting, went missing, and the contents were later found in the communal tea urn. Potentially, no fewer than 97 people could have had their stomachs burnt out, and many might well have died. Clearly Young's desire to convince the authorities of his rehabilitation was soon disregarded once he was presented with such a golden opportunity to poison those around him. In Broadmoor, however, the unwritten rules of prison life applied, which meant the fellow prisoners who discovered what had happened refused to inform on Young to the authorities, but instead meted out their own physical punishment in private. In June 1970, after nearly 8 years in Broadmoor, Dr. Edgar Udwin, the prison psychiatrist, wrote to the Home Secretary to recommend his release, announcing that Young is no longer obsessed with poisons, violence and mischief. Young was thrilled, and Winifred Young tells of a letter he sent her breaking the news of his impending release. "Your friendly neighborhood Frankenstein will soon be at liberty," he joked. One of Young's nurses had cause to question the wisdom of letting this man walk the streets. Not long before his release he told her, "When I get out, I'm going to kill 1 person for every year I've spent in this place." Incredibly, this apparently sincere comment never reached the ears of the relevant authorities, despite being taken down on file at the time. For all his Frankenstein jokes, Winifred Young was delighted to hear of her brother's full recovery, and eagerly awaited his release from Broadmoor. She was happy to accept the authorities' view that he had been cured, even if she later admitted there was an element of wishful thinking at work. Fred Young was less thrilled, however, still finding it hard to forgive his son for the death of his beloved wife, not to mention the permanent damage Graham had inflicted on him. So when Graham stepped out of the prison gates on February 4, 1971, he went to stay with Winifred and her new husband Dennis in Hemel Hempstead, 40 miles northwest of London. Despite their worries, their food remained uncontaminated, although Graham was still insistent on extolling the virtues of Adolf Hitler, and on this occasion ranted on about a final solution-style approach to the troubles in Northern Ireland, which were reaching a peak around that time. Cured, he may have been. A deeply odd individual he remained. According to Winifred Young, one of the first things her now 23-year-old brother did on his release was to make a sentimental journey to the Chemist's, where he had originally obtained his poisons. He proudly announced his identity to staff there, hoping his notoriety may have stood the test of time. He also returned to his old family home in Neasden, introducing himself to neighbors he had known as a teenager. He even visited his old school headmaster. Tellingly, he seemed much keener to remind them of his notorious past crimes than to boast about his rehabilitation. Young attended a storekeeping training course in Slough and stayed at a hostel in nearby Sippenham. He befriended 34-year-old Trevor Sparks, another resident of the hostel, and the two occasionally visited a pub together or shared a bottle of wine in Sparks' room. Young would later confess to poisoning Sparks with antimony sodium tartrate. On the night of February 10, Sparks fell violently ill, exhibiting diarrhea, pins and needles in his legs and pains in his testicles. Earlier in the evening he had accepted a glass of water from Young. Sparks' symptoms returned periodically over the following months. He felt so ill during a football match that he had to leave the pitch after a few minutes. Specialists were unable to pinpoint the cause, variously diagnosing it as a kidney infection, bowel infection, urinary tract infection, or stomach infection. Sparks left Slough in April 1971 and gradually recovered. Young secured a job as assistant storekeeper at John Hadland Laboratories in Bovingdon, Hertfordshire, near his sister's home in Hemel Hempstead. The company manufactured thallium bromide iodide infrared lenses, which were used in military equipment. However, no thallium was stored on site, necessitating Young obtaining his supplies of the poison from a London chemist. On his application, Young falsely claimed that his lack of employment history was because he had suffered a nervous breakdown following the death of his mother in a car accident. His employers received references as part of his rehabilitation from Broadmoor, but were not informed that he was a convicted poisoner and a former Broadmoor patient. Young left Slough and rented a room in Maynard Road, Hemel Hempstead, at £4 per week. Young's new colleagues found him unpredictable. He could be surly and keep to himself, but on other days he could be more cheerful. During breaks he usually sat alone reading, invariably a book on one of his favorite subjects: war, chemistry, the Nazis or famous murderers. Young was not talkative unless one of his favorite topics was being discussed. His duties at Hadland included collecting drinks from the tea trolley in the corridor and bringing them to the storeroom. Each employee had their own mug, which made it easier for him to target specific individuals for poisoning. Soon after Young's arrival at Hadland, he started poisoning his co-workers, focusing on his immediate colleagues in the storerooms. His modus operandi was to slip poison, usually antimony or thallium, into their tea or coffee. Victims would fall ill with symptoms that included vomiting, stomach pains, nausea and diarrhea. Initially, the mysterious illness was assumed to be a virus and was nicknamed the Bovingdon bug. Other explanations put forward were contamination of the local water supply and radioactivity from a disused airfield nearby. Young's first victim in Bovingdon was 59-year-old Bob Eggle, a storeroom manager at Hadland and Young's immediate superior. Eggle, a veteran of the Dunkirk evacuation, was often asked by Young about his wartime experiences. He began to fall ill in June 1971, weeks after Young's arrival at the company, taking several days off work with diarrhea and severe stomach pains. His health improved after a week-long holiday, but on his return Young put a lethal dose of thallium in his afternoon tea. Eggl's condition deteriorated rapidly from this point, consisting of intense back pain and numbness in his fingers and feet. He was transferred to the intensive care unit at St. Albans City Hospital, where paralysis set in. Young seemingly showed a strong concern for Eggle, repeatedly contacting the hospital for updates on his progress. Eggle finally died on the 7th of July, 1971. A post-mortem attributed Eggle's death to a rare form of polyneuritis known as Guillain-Barré syndrome. Young was chosen to accompany managing director Godfrey Foster to Eggle's funeral as a representative of the department Eggle had managed. Foster recalled Young remarking how sad it was that Bob should come through the terrors of Dunkirk only to fall victim to some strange virus. During Eggle's absences, Young targeted his assistant Ron Hewitt, poisoning his tea with antimony. Hewitt had already accepted a job at another company and was working his notice. Young was specifically hired as his replacement. After leaving the company, he suffered no further symptoms. As a result of Eggle's death and Hewitt's departure, Young was promoted to head storeman for a probationary period. For the next few months, his poisonings were limited to small doses of antimony in his co-worker Diana Smart's tea, usually when she annoyed him. Young wrote in his diary, "Di meaning Diana Smart, irritated me yesterday, so I packed her off home with an attack of sickness. I only gave her something to shake her up. I now regret that I didn't give her a larger dose, capable of laying her up for a few days." On the 8th of October 1971, Young put thallium acetate in David Tilson's tea. Tilson found the tea too sweet for his liking. Young had added sugar to disguise any unusual taste from the thallium, and therefore did not drink it all. Young administered a second dose of thallium a week later. Tilson was admitted to hospital with numb legs, breathing difficulties and chest pains. His skin was so tender he could not endure the weight of the bedsheets, and all his hair fell out. Young had a backup plan to visit Tilson in hospital and offer him a bottle of brandy laced with more thallium. Subsequently, Tilson recovered, though he was left permanently impotent by the poisoning. At the same time he was poisoning Tilson, Young also began poisoning another Hadland employee, Jethro Bat. Bat had become friendly with Young and would give him a ride home to Hemel Hempstead. Young admitted to administering 4 grams of thallium to Bat in 2 doses. Enough to kill him. However, Bat found the coffee Young had made for him too strong and did not drink it all. Nevertheless, Bat was admitted to hospital with stomach and chest pains, and his hair fell out. The poisoning made him suicidal. Bat ultimately recovered, but like Tilson he was also left impotent. Young apparently felt some remorse for poisoning Bat, writing in his diary, "I feel rather ashamed in my action in harming J. Bat." Fred Biggs, a 56-year-old local councillor and part-time employee at Hadland, was poisoned by Young with antimony, prompting the typical Bovingdon bug symptoms. Then, on the 30th of October 1971, Young put 3 doses of thallium acetate in Biggs' tea. By the following day, Biggs had developed chest pains and had trouble walking. Within days, he was admitted to Hemel Hempstead General Hospital, then transferred to the Whittington Hospital in North London, followed by the London National Hospital for Nervous Diseases, now part of the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery. His central nervous system deteriorated to the point that he could not speak and had trouble breathing, and his skin began to peel off. Young expressed concern for Biggs' condition, continually telephoning Biggs' wife and the hospital directly to make inquiries. Biggs finally died on the 19th of November, 1971. By this time speculation as to what was causing the Bovingdon bug had understandably reached fever pitch. Winifred Young writes that Diana Smart even confided in the firm's managing director, Godfrey Foster, that she suspected Graham Young was the germ carrier. Alas, the only suggestion she could make as to how he might have caught such germs was that he lived in a boarding house with a Pakistani family. On the afternoon that Fred Bigg's death was announced, the firm's doctor gathered the staff to a meeting to reassure them that there was no evidence that any lack of hygiene on the company premises could have caused the deaths and illnesses. Yet one man wanted to know more. The doctor was surprised to find himself being grilled by the young store assistant, who asked several detailed questions as to why poisoning by the heavy metal thallium had been ruled out. The doctor was puzzled by his apparent in-depth knowledge of the subject, and told the firm's owner. He in turn informed the police. It's perhaps not so surprising that doctors took a while to consider thallium poisoning as a cause of the outbreak, because until Graham Young used it, it had never been used as a poison in Britain. Death from gradual thallium poisoning is an agonizing affair, something which Graham Young knew only too well. As well as suffering excruciating stomach pains, violent sickness and diarrhea, patients often lose their hair, as did Bat and Tilson, and young stepmother Molly years before, and suffer thickening and scaliness of the skin. Later, degeneration of the nerve fibers sets in, along with weakness of the limbs leading to paralysis, and eventually delirium. The victim usually dies through not being able to breathe. It's almost worse if the sufferer survives, since the body gets rid of the thallium slowly, meaning days or weeks of agony. If the dose is repeated, it has the effect of being an accumulative poison, which kills gradually over a week or two. All things considered, it's a long, slow method of murdering someone, of which any sadist would be proud. Graham Young may not have been a sadist in the conventional sense, but he did take great pleasure in following and noting down every last gruesome symptom each of his victims suffered, recording them each day in exercise books and plotting graphs to analyze their progress. This almost fetishistic documentation proved his downfall. Once the firm's MD had alerted police, it didn't take detectives long to work out that the illnesses had started shortly after a certain individual had joined the Bovingdon firm. A quick consultation from a couple of forensic scientists revealed the symptoms of the victims were consistent with thallium poisoning. They were also kind enough to finally inform the firm's bosses that Graham Young was a convicted poisoner. Police immediately searched Graham Young's room in nearby Hemel Hempstead, where they were confronted with walls covered in pictures of Hitler and other Nazi leaders, accompanied by drawings of emaciated figures holding bottles marked poison, clutching their throats as their hair fell out. They also found bottles, files and tubes lined along the windowsill, and under his bed lay the incriminating diary, with a number of entries following the progress of his patients. The day was Saturday, November 21, 1971, and Young was visiting his father Fred and Aunt Winnie in Sheerness, Kent, some 80 miles away. It was 11:30 at night when police knocked on the door, and Fred Young immediately knew what they wanted. He pointed the officers towards his son, and Winnie asked her nephew Graham, "What have you done?" "I don't know what they are talking about, Auntie," he replied. But as he was being led out, Fred Young heard him ask the officers, "Which one are you doing me for?" After they had left, Fred gathered together Graham's birth certificate and every other document relating to his son and tore them to shreds. Once in custody, Young admitted to the poisonings under interrogation, and even boasted of committing the perfect murder of his stepmother back in 1962, knowing he could still deny everything in court. He laughed mockingly when he was asked for a written statement admitting his guilt, yet for all his grotesque arrogance, he soon told police the charade is over, and was clearly resigned to his fate. That didn't mean, however, that he wouldn't have his day in court. He planned to wring every ounce of notoriety from the case, in pursuit of his ambition to become the most infamous poisoner of all time. Graham Young's trial took place at St. Albans Crown Court in June 1972. On the defense stand, he eloquently argued the toss with the prosecuting counsel, relishing the ultimate intellectual challenge of escaping justice. He was very proud of being the first person to use thallium in a poisoning case in Britain, remembers Peter Goodman, Young's defense lawyer. For him the whole thing was one big chemistry experiment, and I suppose the trial was an experiment in seeing if he could use his knowledge to argue his way out of it. He was clearly a very intelligent fellow, says Susan Novak, who was in court to report on the trial for the Watford Observer, but he also came across as incredibly creepy. You didn't want to make eye contact with him, because he just had this unnerving aura about him. Young clearly enjoyed conveying such a chilling impression. When the press asked for a picture of the defendant, he insisted they use one in which he looked particularly cold-eyed and sinister. As it happened, the glowering photograph actually came about by accident. Holden explains that Young was scowling because he thought he had been cheated out of some money by the coin-operated photo booth where the picture was taken. It's hard to believe that Young seriously held out much hope of being acquitted, but that doesn't account for the supreme arrogance of a man who regarded himself as far more intelligent than virtually everyone he encountered. While awaiting trial, he wrote to his cousin Sandra insisting, "I stand a good chance of acquittal, for the prosecution case has a number of inherent weaknesses. A strong point in my favor is that I am not guilty of the charges." Young's initial confidence was based on the assumption that the prosecution wouldn't be able to prove beyond doubt that only he could have administered the poisons. Since Bob Eggle had been cremated, he assumed proof of thallium poisoning would be impossible, while he had made a point of offering Fred Biggs some thallium grains to help him kill bugs in his garden, knowing he could later claim that Biggs had misused them. As for the diary relating to the victims, he claimed they were figments of his imagination, on which he planned to base a novel. Even a confession couldn't stand in his way. Despite having verbally admitted his crimes to police on his initial arrest, he claimed in court that he had simply told police what he thought they wanted to hear, in order to be allowed food and clothing. He reckoned without advances in forensic science that had been made since 1962, when Molly Young's cremation meant her murder could not be proved. Experts succeeded in finding traces of thallium in Bob Eggle's ashes. Fred Biggs' wife confirmed that he never used Young's thallium on his garden, and as for that claim about the diary, once read out in court, the diary entries sounded distinctly non-fictional. Excerpts included the following: F means, Fred is now seriously ill. He has developed paralysis and blindness. Even if the blindness is reverse, organic brain disease would render him a husk. From my point of view, his death would be a relief. It would remove one more casualty from an already crowded field of battle. On Diana Smart, DI irritated me yesterday, so I packed her off home with a dose of illness. On an unidentified delivery driver, in a way it seems a shame to condemn such a likable man to such a horrible end, but I have made my decision. Luckily for the driver concerned, there wasn't a delivery that week. His entries also revealed a plan to murder David Tilson in his hospital bed, after Young's initial doses had failed to finish him off. Young intended to visit Tilson and offer him a swig from a hip flask of brandy, which he knew Tilson would probably accept, but also not tell the nurses about, since drinking was against hospital rules. Needless to say, the patient would have found himself intoxicated in more lethal ways than he expected. Tilson's relatively late admission to hospital, and subsequent month off recuperating, apparently saved his life. He eventually made a full recovery. Adding all this evidence to the thallium and antimony found in Young's room, and a file in Young's jacket, which he had intended to use as his exit dose, if he was caught, the prosecution had a strong case. Young had taunted police that they could not convict him without demonstrating a motive, but with such powerful evidence of murder, they didn't need to show a clear motive. Young was convicted of 2 murders, 2 attempted murders, and 2 counts of administering poison. He was sentenced to 4 counts of life imprisonment alongside 2 5-year sentences, and although he had told warders he would break his own neck on the dock railings if convicted, he failed to live up to his promise. There was still a sensation in the courtroom, however, when Young's background was revealed after the guilty verdict. There were gasps of disbelief when it was announced that Young had done this kind of thing before, and had been released from a secure mental institution mere months previously. Through his counsel, Young requested that he be sent to a conventional prison rather than return to Broadmoor. His request was granted and he was sentenced to life imprisonment, to be served at Park Lane Hospital, later Ashworth Hospital, in Maghull. While at Ashworth, Young befriended Moore's murderer Ian Brady, with whom he shared a fascination for Nazi Germany. Brady's 2001 book, The Gates of Janus, in which he discusses various serial killers, includes a chapter on Young. Brady wrote that Young was genuinely asexual, finding even discussion of sexual matters not only uninteresting, but also distinctly distasteful. Power and death were his aphrodisiacs and raisons d'etre. Elsewhere, Brady stated that it was difficult not to empathize with Graham Young. Young died in his cell at HM Prison Parkhurst on the evening of the 1st of August 1990, 1 month before his 43rd birthday. The cause of death was listed as myocardial infarction. As Young had no history of heart disease, it has been speculated that he either committed suicide, or was murdered by prisoners, or prison staff, who did not feel safe around him. Young was cremated on the 15th of August 1990, and his ashes were scattered on the beach on the 2nd of September 1990. This is all I have for this case. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up. Your support means a lot and helps us create more content for you. See you in the next video.